So we've made our way to 2 Samuel. And the 1 Samuel last week, Israel had its first king that they begged for, although God told them, don't do it. Don't do it. You won't like the outcome. And sure enough, they did it. And they didn't like the outcome with King Saul. And 2 Samuel then is primarily the story of Israel's second king, David. Most of our focus here will be on him. How in the world does one describe David? He was so multifaceted. I mean, shepherd, giant killer, mighty military leader, psalmist. He wrote over half the Psalms. Musician, author, king, adulterer, murderer, highly dysfunctional father, man after God's own heart. It sort of scrambles your brain a little, doesn't it? I mean, so many sides to that diamond. Amazing that all those inscriptions apply to the same man. And 2 Samuel is basically the story of his life as the king of Israel and the Hebrew life under his leadership. 2 Samuel is an absolutely compelling book. Its stories are impacting. Its lessons often highly confusing. Is David one of the greatest saints of all time? A man after God's own heart who wrote over half the Psalms? Or is he one of the most wicked sinners ever, committing adultery with someone in his kingdom who he had great power over, and then murdering not only her husband, but several other innocent soldiers as well? So which is he? Great saint, great sinner? The answer is, he, like many of us, both. 2 Samuel is a story of sin and its consequences. And at the same time, the book of 2 Samuel is just as mysterious and confusing as David is. Because it's a story of great shame and sin and consequences, but it's also a story of great grace and mercy and forgiveness. And we need all of those messages. So, just as a quick way of review, last week in 1 Samuel, with Saul's death, the door seems open now for David to return, because you remember David has already been anointed king once, right, by Saul at Jesse's house. So the door seems open for David to return home to the land of Israel, but David shows his great trust in God by, first of all, consulting the Lord. And when I read that passage, I thought, well, there's a path that seems right, but in the end it leads to death, that famous proverb, because self-deception is always a possibility. We must always guard against it. It is so easy for us to deceive ourselves, for us to think one thing, and for Satan to really help us to think that way. But God really have a different way and a different will. So we should always guard against self-deception. So David seeks advice from the Lord after Saul dies about what to do next. All right, I've been anointed king. What should I do next? And the Lord tells him to go to Hebron, where he is publicly acclaimed and anointed as king over Judah in chapter 2, the first 7 verses. However, as one might suspect, Saul's family has gotten kind of used to the palace. Saul's family has gotten kind of used to the king's life, and so they absolutely reject him as king, and they have no intention of handing the monarchy over to David. So a surviving son of Saul named Ishbosheth is given the kingship by the strong-willed commander of Saul's army, Abner. We studied some about him last week. And so here you have the conflict, and a series of battles began between Saul's forces led by Ishbosheth, his son, and Abner, Saul's former general, and David's forces. And this battle continues for years over the kingship. And finally, in chapter 3, verse 1, we read, it was the beginning of a long war between those who were loyal to Saul and those loyal to David. But over time, as time passed, David became stronger and stronger. Saul's dynasty became weaker and weaker. And a turning point in the war is actually reached when Abner, Saul's longtime military commander, defects to David. But unaware that Abner has done that, Joab, who is David's longtime military commander, murders Abner. And so, because of that, the war slowly ended and Saul's people gave up. And when that happened, chapter 5 says all the tribes of Israel went to David. So now he's united them all 12 of them. Finally, the civil war that has taken place between the house of Saul and the house of David has ended. And so all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron and told him, we're your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel. Even Saul's people are giving in now. They realize we've lost your king. Hey, we always were for you. You always were the one who led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people Israel. You will be Israel's leader. So there at Hebron, David made a covenant before the Lord with all the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. And he was 30 years old. I want you to remember that in a moment. He was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in all. So I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but David actually got anointed king 3 different times. The first time was by Samuel while David was still at his father Jesse's house, and we studied that last week. He was the last of the sons looked at, and God said, don't look on the outside, for God looks at the heart, and anointed him then. And the second time is now, upon his return to Judah and to the city of Hebron. And the third time will be 7 years from now, when he becomes king of all Israel in Jerusalem. And I find that very interesting. 3 anointings as king for the one job, the one position. And the reason I find it interesting is the Bible also says at each of these occasions, at each of these anointings, God gave him a fresh dose of his Spirit. Maybe that was the reason why. Maybe the reason he had the 3 different anointings is so God could express his tremendous confidence and faith in David and give him a fresh empowerment every time he needed it. The life of David can easily be divided down, very easily. At the end of 1 Samuel chapter 16 that we looked at last week, David is running from Saul. Saul's so jealous of him, David has to go on the run from him for his life. In the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, David is building the greatest kingdom Israel ever knew. I'll point out some facts about that in just a few moments. What a first 15 or 20 years as king he had. And then in the last half of the book of Samuel, he's reeling. So he was running, then he was reigning, then he was reeling. And that is really the way to describe his life. The text we just read said he was king for 40 years. So let's just take the most common age we believe David was when Samuel anointed him king at his father's house and just before he went to fight Goliath. it's 15 or 16. Almost all scholars believe it's right in that area. So let's just take 15, 16, okay? He served in Saul's court for approximately 3 years. We know that. Before he went on the run. And he was on the run for about 10 years. Give a year or two, take either way. So that means David spent somewhere between 12 and 15 years in preparation for serving as king 40 years. And I only bring that up for one reason. Often we dread and bemoan the time of preparation we have for a task or a job. We think it'll never, ever end. And sometimes that's true of us as Christians too. We think, when will I be ready to do exactly what God's will is for my life? But David's prep time was a small price to pay for his reigning 4 decades over the most glorious time in Israel's history. There was a new king in Israel, and a new king needs a new capital city. Hebron, if you know anything about the math of first century Israel, Hebron was way too far south to serve as a capital for a united kingdom of all 12 tribes. So David needed a city more centrally located. Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level. Did you know that? How many of you have been to Jerusalem? Raise your hand. Handful or two. It is 2,500 feet above sea level. Its climate is very pleasant. It is very easily defendable, and it sits right smack dab in the middle of the promised land. It is the most fought over piece of land in the history of the world. And since Jerusalem had been in Jebusite hands for 400 years now, it was not tied to any one Israelite tribe. It would make the perfect capital for Israel's kingdom. Eventually, this is going to be David's palace here in Jerusalem, or where it was located in Jerusalem in that time period. So let me just say that the Jebusites, just like Saul's family, had no intention of just handing it over to David. No intention. David led his men to Jerusalem to fight against the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of the land who were living there. And the Jebusites taunted David, saying, "You'll never get in here. Even the blind and the lame can keep you out." For the Jebusites thought they were safe. But they had not factored in one major decision, just as the city of Jericho had not hundreds of years before. David's God. David captured the fortress of Zion, which is now called the City of David. Still is by many people called that. And David made the fortress his home, and he called it the City of David. And he extended the city, starting at the supporting terraces, and worked inward. Now, I want to say a word about this. David became more and more powerful because the Lord of heaven's armies was with him. David is now at the very zenith and the very apex of life. He is finally ruling over a united kingdom. He had expanded, you read there in that last verse, he had expanded the boundaries of Israel from approximately 6,000 square miles to just over 60,000 square miles. 10 times what it was when he became king. He had never known a single political defeat. He had never known a single military defeat. The economy is running on all 8 cylinders. There was not only a chicken in every pot and a chariot in every garage, there were grapes on every vine. Rivers and prosperity were everywhere. I mean, it was the wealthiest, greatest empire on earth at the time. And so now, having accomplished all of that for God and for his people, David finally wants to do something that's been on his mind. It's one of the greatest acts of kindness that you will see in the book of the Old Testament. Now that all the battles had been fought and had been won, and peace had been established, and prosperity was through the whole land, he goes back and asks his staff, is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Now just suppose that he pauses there, as he should in a sentence. Is anyone in Saul's family still alive? And I could just imagine that his staff members are standing around going, oh boy, here we go. Because what kings did in ancient days were they wiped out their predecessor's family completely. Because, like we saw with Mephibosheth, the predecessor's family usually wouldn't give up easily and wanted to keep fighting for their kingdom. And so, this is still just a few years later, mind you. And when he asked, is anyone in Saul's family still alive, I'm sure his servants and staff thought, here it goes. He's going to kill off all the remaining parts of Saul's family. But no, that's not what he says. Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now, he didn't know one of the family members that was still alive was actually Jonathan's own son. You remember, David and Jonathan were like this, best friends, closely knit together. And he didn't know that when he asked that. So David was not just interested in showing kindness. The word here is the word chesed in the original language. And kindness in verse 3 is the word chesed. And it literally means undeserved, unwarranted, unmerited favor. It's similar to our word grace that we use in the New Testament. So he was wanting to extend the same kind of grace to Jonathan's family and to David's family as God had given him. I don't know of any greater definition of grace than that phrase, the kindness of God. And so, he was told that yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He's a crippled young man and crippled in both feet. His name was Mephibosheth. And from that time on, David brought Mephibosheth into his own palace, treated him like one of the king's own sons, returned to him all of the land that Saul had owned as king. Wow. Now, he didn't have to do that. And the reason I pause in this book that's got so many other lessons to bring this one that many people don't even know about up is because it is a perfect picture of what the Lord has done for us. The Lord did not have to give us all his land in heaven. The Lord did not have to forgive us and show us chesed. He did not have to do it. But he has chosen to do it. And he has chosen to make us his own children and give us his own home for all of eternity. It's a great picture of that story, what David did for Mephibosheth. It is literally God's grace on display. And so David is at the height, the zenith, the apex of life. He's in middle age. He's accomplished just about all there is possible to accomplish. He's conquered all of his enemies. He's extended the kingdom. He's a man after God's own heart. He's ready for a fall. It was the Scottish judge Francis Jeffrey was once quoted as saying, a good name is got by many actions and lost by one. And lost by one. My mother used to say to my brother and I all the time, boys, it takes a lifetime to build a good reputation, but only one night to tear it down. We've all seen that true in the lives of people we've known, haven't we? Boys, it takes a lifetime to build a good reputation, but only one night to tear it down. Oh, if David had only heeded those warnings himself. But one night of pleasure cost the king of Israel decades of distress. And it starts in chapter 11, in the spring of the year when kings normally go out to war. And you say, what in the world is that? Well, it's too cold to fight in the winter. Too difficult to move the equipment. Too difficult to move the chariots. Too difficult to move the equipment. So spring was the time when battles began and were fought until it was winter again. And David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites, and they destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now why? I don't know. He never had before. Why did David stay behind in Jerusalem? He decides to sit this battle out. You know what week this is we are in right now in Southwest Florida? This is spring break week. And all the kids are out of school this next week. And by the way, our church offices are going to be closed. If you need anything this week, because all our secretaries have children and they're with their families and doing things. So if you need anything, call me. Don't need anything. That's the best thing. But I'm such a bad boy. But anyway, it's spring break week here. David decides to go on spring break. Spring, time for war. And David decides to take a spring break week himself. For 17 consecutive years, he has ridden out a string of unprecedented successes. He has had the Midas touch militarily. Every battle his army has ever fought, they have won. Hey, David, you've been working a little hard. How about taking a little vacation? How about a little R&R? How about a little spring break? Drop your guard. Chill out. Enjoy the fruits of your labor. Let Joab take over and run the army for a while. So he did. He's on spring break while the armies are out battling, and late one afternoon after his midday rest, he got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace, and he looked out over the city and noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. And he sent someone to find out who she was and was told she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife. Now that's a very important point that often gets skipped over in this passage. The daughter of Eliam. Eliam was one of David's best friends and strategic planners. And Eliam never got over what happened. I'm not going to have time to cover it today, but if you want to study it on your own, do. Look up Eliam and study his story. So she's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why David wasn't at war like he always had been. The Bible doesn't address why Bathsheba was on the roof of her Jerusalem condo in full view of the king's palace, bathing in the bath. Doesn't tell us. Maybe she didn't know he was at home. But we do know this. If David had been doing what he was supposed to be doing and what God had called him to do, this incident would never have happened. Would never have happened. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. He was doing what he wasn't supposed to do. It's been said, the devil tempts idle men, but idle men tempt the devil. It's one thing to take a break. It's another thing to include God in the break. It's one thing to take a break. It's another thing to take a break from God. Because you can be sure the tempter, the devil, never takes a break, never takes a vacation. So always be on guard. Let me park here for just a second and say it was not the look that brought David down, but what took place afterwards. Sometimes, and particularly in the society we live, you cannot avoid the look. It's right in front of you, everywhere you are. It was not the look that brought David down. It is not the temptation that brings us down. It is what takes place afterwards. The look was innocent. The surge of manly feelings that rushed over him are normal, but David failed to control his thoughts. And that's the first place he got in trouble, because the thoughts control the actions and the desires. Someone once said promiscuity begins in the head long before it ends in the bed. So David has now committed adultery with another man's wife, and that is a deed that not even the great king can undo. Its consequences are going to haunt him forever. But understand, at this point, that's not what David thinks. At this point, that's not what David thinks. David thinks one night stand, gotten away with it, no problem. Nobody will ever know about it except for me and Bathsheba. I'll repent of it and we'll move on with our lives. But when Bathsheba discovered she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, I'm pregnant. A lot of men have received that message, also not expecting it. Now David has a real problem on his hands and a choice to make, an important choice to make. The king, like everybody else in life, including you and me, can conceal or confess. He can admit his sin and confess and ask forgiveness, or he can conceal it and try to cover it up. All of us have the same choice all the time. Which will he do? Well, I think from history, we all know. He begins an elaborate cover-up plan. An elaborate cover-up plan that is going to wind up worse than the initial sin. It is amazing the extremes to which a proud person will go to cover up their sin. I mean, I've seen that for years in ministry. So many times people have come to me for counseling and it's been, no, I didn't do this, no, I didn't do this, no, I didn't do this, until the evidence kept growing and growing and growing, and then it's, yeah, I did it. Just like David. It's amazing. Can you remember the last president of the United States that wasn't under, and I know some of that's political, I understand that, don't misunderstand me, but some of it is also because there's enough evidence to suggest problems. Can you even remember the last president of the United States that wasn't being investigated over and over and over again for stuff that seems kind of real, some of it? I don't. I'd have to go back in my memory at least 45 or 50 years or more. I mean, I think, goodness, maybe not in my whole lifetime. I might have to go all the way back to Eisenhower. And it's amazing how none of them, like King David in his power, have ever just come out and said, yeah, I messed up, I screwed up. And that's not just true of politicians, that's true of preachers, that's true of business people, that's true of most everybody. But nowhere is it better illustrated than in the life of David. The king commits adultery, then adds to his deception betrayal and eventually murder. And here is how despicable David's been. Bathsheba's husband Uriah is a soldier in battle fighting for David, while the king is seducing his wife. And when David realizes that Uriah is in battle, he sees a possible way out. He thinks to himself, I'm going to send for Uriah, have him come home for his spring break too. And he, like me, will not be able to deny the wiles of his wife. And everybody will think the baby is his. So when Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing, like he cared. Then he told Uriah, go on home and relax. It's spring break week. He even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. You know why? Because Uriah was an honorable man who had made a vow and a commitment to his band of brothers. That's why. David heard that Uriah had not gone home, and he summoned him and asked, what's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long? And Uriah said, the ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. These are my band of brothers. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing. That's an honorable man. David says, go on home. Sleep in your own bed tonight. Cuddle up to your wife. You've been fighting on the front lines. You deserve a pleasurable night. And I feel pretty certain that Bathsheba was coached to do her part. And everybody will think this is Uriah's baby with Bathsheba. But Uriah is so honorable. And so, here's what happens. David realizes plan A is not going to work. He has to quickly come up with plan B. So he calls Joab, sends a letter by Uriah to Uriah is delivering his own death sentence, is delivering his own death letter. Writes a king's letter, seals it, sends Uriah with it out to the front lines of battle, hands to Joab, and the letter says, put Uriah on the front lines of battle, charge into battle, and then withdraw quickly. Because the people on the front lines almost always died first. And then especially if they didn't have their backup. And so that's exactly what happened. Now get this, we've often said, and Uriah was killed, so David was guilty of murder. No, David was guilty of multiple murder. The text says several soldiers were killed to cover up David's sin. And David thinks he's gotten away with it. It's covered up. The baby is born. Nearly a full year passes. And God sends the prophet Nathan, who earlier had been the very one who had pronounced God's blessings upon David, to now confront him with his sin. And Nate, how would you like to be Nathan? Huh? How would you like to be Nathan, having to go in and make... I mean, his life could be on the line. The king's he's already murdered several other men trying to cover this up. How would you like to have Nathan's job here? And so Nathan comes up with a unique way to confront David. He tells him a parable about a rich man with many sheep killing the pet lamb of a very, very poor man and offering that pet lamb as food for his guests at a banquet. And David is utterly outraged. He says, as surely as the Lord lives, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. And he must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole for having no pity. And Nathan then looks him right in the eye and points and says, you are that man. Now, did you notice this? He must repay 4 lambs. 4-to-1 ratio. And so as a result, Nathan says God is going to give you a 4-fold punishment for your sin. In other words, David prescribed his own punishment for himself, even though he didn't know it. He said, from this time on, your family will live by the sword, because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. And if you know anything about, literally, from that time on, I'm going to tell you two of the stories, but there are multiple ones. From that time on, David's family was in conflict with one another. And because of what you've done, punishment number 2, I will cause your own household to rebel against you, and I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view, which happened. And Absalom, out of his own household, drove him from the palace out into the hills, attempting to overthrow his own father for the kingdom. Punishment number 3. You did this in secret, but I will make it happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. And David is humiliated by the adultery of his wives, by being run out of town by his own son. And then came the one, that so agonized him. Punishment number 4. Because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord by doing this, the child that you've had with Bathsheba will die. David went into deep mourning and begged God to change that prescription to no avail. And the next few chapters then tell the sordid story of the consequences of David's sin. Now, I want you to understand, all these things happened, but the primary reason that they happened was because David's sin set them in motion. I do not have time to tell the whole story of Tamar and Amnon in chapter 13, but I told it last year to the teenagers on the first night of Vacation Bible School. I told them this story because it's such an important story about choosing your friends, about the importance of choosing your friends. Because Tamar and Amnon were half brother and sister. Amnon was David's son by one of his wives, and Tamar was his daughter by another wife. And Amnon had a great crush on Tamar. She was very beautiful, chapter 13 says. But he realized they were kin and couldn't do anything about it. But Amnon, the text literally says this in 2 Samuel 13:2. But Amnon had a friend. And this friend was very crafty, the text says. And the friend told him a plan and laid out a plan for him by which he could seduce his own half-sister. And he did. And so he assaulted, or we would call it today, definitely raped, his own half-sister. And that created a tidal wave because, guess what? Absalom, we're going to hear about next, Absalom was Tamar's full brother. And Absalom wanted revenge on Amnon for what he had done. And it's a long story, but Absalom waited for a year and then had Amnon killed. It's so sordid, but remember, your family will live by the sword and your own household will rebel against you. It's part of those consequences. And now this same Absalom is going to be a part of those consequences as well. Absalom, you could call ambitious Absalom. He began to undermine his father with an eye on becoming king. And he was a politician extraordinaire. He got up every morning and went out to the gate of the city, and when people brought a case to the king for judgment, now that's David, Absalom would intercept them and would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe, and Absalom would say, well, you got a really strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge. No, he wishes I was the king. Then everybody could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice. And when people tried to bow before them, he wouldn't let them. But just like a politician, he would take them by the hand and kiss them. Maybe that's where kissing babies came from. I don't know. but what a politician he was. And Absalom did this with everybody who came to the king for judgment. So he stole the hearts of all the people of Israel. So just picture this in your mind. The people are coming to the king at the palace for judgment, and Absalom is intercepting them just outside and just playing the politics, man. Kissing them, telling them I would hear your case, I would give you a positive ruling and all those sorts of things. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And verse 12 says, he actually gained strength with his conspiracy. And Absalom's following kept on increasing. And when David heard of the conspiracy and Absalom's growing popularity, he fled Jerusalem. I've often pondered on that. I don't know. Did he just not want to fight his own son, fight his own family? That could be. I wouldn't want to. Did he think he was behind and he wouldn't be successful? Did he just not have the fight anymore? Or did he? And I think this could probably be it. Feel so guilty because he knew he had set in motion all that was happening. Well, what a pitiful sight. The king, the man after God's own heart, running from his own son. The armies of the father and the son eventually clash in a dense forest, and Absalom's long hair, the Bible said he had beautiful long hair, gets tangled in a tree, leaving him dangling, and then Joab, David's war commander, comes along and has his armor bearers kill him. And Joab and his forces expect David to be grateful to them for delivering him from Absalom and for saving his kingdom. Instead, David is the exact opposite. He is utterly devastated and goes into deep mourning. He went up to the very top room in the entire palace over the gateway and burst into tears and said, "Oh, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son. 6 times in just a few words, he says, my son. He is brokenhearted. And he knows he's mostly to blame. And whenever I've read this passage, I often hone in right here. And I think, if only David had gone to war in the spring like he had done for 17 years. If only David had seen Bathsheba and then just turned his head and walked away. If only. The great Charles Spurgeon once wrote, our children may plunge into the worst of sins, but they are our children still. They may scoff at our God. They may tear our heart to pieces with their wickedness. We cannot take complacency in them, but at the same time, we cannot unchild them, nor erase their image from our hearts. All of us, at some time or another, have known that feeling. All of us have known what Spurgeon said is true, and what David says here is true. Oh, my son, or oh, my daughter, if only. I feel pretty certain David realized just how responsible he had been for what his son had become. His insensitivity opened the door for Amnon's sin. David's failure to discipline caused Absalom to feel like he had to take action against Amnon because of Tamar. David's unwillingness to forgive stirred up Absalom's rebellion. David's lusts were mimicked by his own son, later particularly. with Solomon. Absalom's death was David's greatest failure, and he mourns deeply. And I want to spend a minute or two closing by saying a word about that in humanity, because this is so important as we go through the Old Testament in particular with these stories. The Bible is not a book of propaganda. It tells it exactly like it is. It doesn't try to make flawless heroes out of flawed human beings. Even the great psalm writer, giant killer, man after God's own heart, was flawed. The Bible gives us the whole story, warts and all. There is no spin machine out front leaving out the thoroughly human parts in order to make it more appealing to all of us. And to me, that lack of sugarcoating is one of the things that makes the Bible most believable. The fact that it is brutally honest. Right? If you want to state it this way, you can. The Bible is not a book that man would write if he could, or could write if he would. It's not. It's the direct, warts and all story of what happened. And that's why it's such a great, great authoritative witness for us.